The War of 1812 sure is one of the wars of all time. The US was angered at the British impressment of their sailors, trade restrictions on the former colony against Napoleonic France, and support for Native American resistance in the Great Lakes. Also, they really wanted Canada. Thus, they sent an ultimatum to the UK. End the impressment and trade restrictions or face war, to which the British acquiesced. But we didn't get the memo until 2 months after we invaded, so the war was still on. Over the next 3 years, the US and UK would clash over the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, with skirmishes in other parts of the US, including a notable burning of the White House. Threats of a New England Revolt and the US being denied its northwestern territories via Tecumseh's confederacy led to nationalists calling it a second revolution. However, after the treaty was ratified, nothing fundamentally changed. The New England Secession never materialized, the US was able to secure Ohio, and they were just kept out of Quebec, the longest lasting consequence being the rise of Jackson. But this begs the question, what if the US really lost the War of 1812? Now we're going for about as radical a British victory as we can realistically get, so we're going to need several different points of divergence even within the military situation. Firstly, we're going to have Isaac Brock survive the Battle of Queenston Heights, keeping the British-Canadian Army in better shape. He also worked better with Tecumseh than his successor George Prevost did. On top of that, we're going to have the British win the Battle of Lake Erie. This campaign allowed the Americans to retake Detroit and kill Tecumseh. Now, I'm not a military person, so I'm just going to cheat and say that some of the schooners assigned to the Great Lakes are sent elsewhere before the war, preventing them from actually being anywhere near the battle. Or maybe the Brits send a couple more of their own from the Caribbean to enforce the Great Lakes prior to hostilities breaking out. Having the British win this battle, however we do it, will keep the British supplies open to Detroit, as well as having Tecumseh's confederation and its leadership survive. In general, we're going to have the Brits just be better prepared for fighting on land as well. While the British did occupy eastern Maine, there doesn't seem to have been much room for them to be marching down south into New York, especially since the Americans did have numbers and the initiative. They just lacked everything else by comparison. We're going to use these enforcements to allow the Brits more power projection into the continent and drag the war out a little while longer. Finally, in addition to changing the military situation and depriving the US of control over the Great Lakes, we're also going to dabble in domestic politics. The War of 1812 was a very partisan and regionalistic war, the Democratic Republicans and the South wanting war, whereas the Anglophilic Federalists in New England, aka the part of the country that would bear the brunt of the assault, wanted peace. Thus, in late 1814, they called a convention in order to force the federal government to address their grievances. Now, despite its reputation for what little it has in modern America, the Hartford Convention was not secessionist in nature, even if people thought it was at the time. Instead, they intended for several amendments to the US Constitution to address the regional balance of power. Among these were preventing any future trade embargoes for lasting more than 60 days, requiring a 2/3 majority for several congressional acts, such as a declaration of war or admitting a new state, forcing the president to only serve one term, and not allowing two presidents to be from the same state back to back, and removing the 3/5 compromise from the Constitution, preventing the South from getting more districts than they'd get if they only counted free white citizens. Now, this list of proposals, let's be real, ultimatum, was unlikely to pass even in the midst of the war, since even one of these is unlikely to get through most of the states. But unfortunately for the Federalists and the convention, it didn't make it to Madison's desk until peace had been signed, so now it looked even more treasonous than it probably already was. Now, like I said, the convention probably wasn't actually plotting to secede, but we're also trying for the most radical British victory we can. So what we're going to do is have the convention meet about a year earlier, while the Brits are advancing in the Great Lakes. They make their demands of the government, hopeful for a swift and just resolution to their crisis, only for Madison to refute them out of hand, seeing the listed demands as an affront to the Union and rule of law. It's also worth noting that the British offensives into New England were pretty limited, restrained to what's now eastern Maine, in contrast to the back and forth on the St. Lawrence River. Absent a better option, the delegates of New England, under the leadership of Massachusetts Governor Caleb Strong, declare independence, citing the refusal of the Madison administration to hear their concern. The Republic of New England declares both independence and neutrality sometime in 1814, but when the Americans refuse to recognize their independence, they reluctantly enter negotiations with the British regarding the return of Maine and a state of co-belligerency. This is not great for the US. While most New England states already refused to mobilize their militia during the war, now they're actively hostile. Of course, several of these New Englander militias and armies will be chaotic and lacking in morale to be fighting alongside the British against their countrymen, even with a weaker sense of nationalism than we're used to today. These are the sons of the Revolution. However, with the springboard this provides the British into places like New Jersey and Long Island, this is still ultimately a disaster for the US politically. Troops are moved around the various Midwestern fronts in a panic as British reinforcements make their way to New England. Also, Vermont refused to attend the convention, and New Hampshire's delegates weren't exactly given the assent of the legislation, which does call into question the legality of New England claiming these states. At this point, things are rough for the Union, especially if the British capture and burn down DC in 1814 like they did in real life. While the city wasn't strategically important to the war as a whole, it was a national humiliation and one that would seriously damage the legitimacy of the Madison administration after all of these other failures. Thus, the US sues for peace early in 1815, and while in our timeline, the US was in a strong enough position to negotiate a territorial antebellum peace and the withdrawal of the British from the Great Lakes, that's not the case here in the slightest. The British pressed hard for the US to recognize Tecumseh's native confederacy, as well as the Republic of New England, which now also includes New Hampshire and at least part of Vermont. The US is forced to pay reparations or give trade concessions, and may even have some ships transferred to the British. They also renounced their claim on the Oregon Territory. While in the periphery of the continent, the US claimed it as soon as it could, due to the obvious advantage of a Pacific port, something not lost on Britain either. This is, to use a technical term, a fucking disaster for the US. New England was at the time the industrial heart of the country, with a commercial economy centered around textile mills and trade with Britain. That is why they opposed the war in the first place. In fact, they've lost their third most populated city in Boston due to the secession of Massachusetts. In addition, the Midwest is now an expansive British protectorate, meaning that expansion west is now pushed very far south if it's possible at all. I fully expect the Madison government to effectively collapse after peace is declared. Radicalism and anger will seep into politics all over the country as the nation tries to find someone to blame for the humiliation, tearing the Democratic-Republican Party apart even faster than in our timeline. Of course, the Federalists, now even more readily and accurately associated with treason, will be just as discredited as their opponents, creating even more chaotic politics. While 1816 is probably a little early for a complete breakdown of the party structure, I would imagine multiple candidates under ostensibly the same party, similar to what happened in 1824. Maybe even enough to send the election to the House. That almost never bodes well in the US, and it won't here. Whoever emerges as the quote-unquote winner will need to navigate an economic freefall, sectional anger, and his party more or less not existing. Despite the collapse of the Federalist Party, I imagine that a nationalist figure, rather than a states' rights idealist, would be in the best position. After all, it was the militia system and the autonomy of the states that allowed the New Englanders to stab the country in the back. It was the decentralized military that left them unable to conquer the Midwest, and now it's the lack of tariffs that are causing the economic collapse in the US, as the US is unable to produce enough goods to pay back Britain readily. The US in this timeline is uniquely vulnerable to strongman politics in a way that it never really was in real life. Even Andrew Jackson, at his worst, was a genuine believer in democracy and populism, which may not be the case for this hypothetical president. One thing he would have in common with Jackson, though, is the Indian Removal Act. If anything, anti-indigenous sentiment in this timeline's America would be heightened to an excessive standard even compared to our timeline, due to the continued existence of Tecumseh's Confederacy as a dagger pointed right at the heart of the Union. Now, speaking of Tecumseh's Confederacy, I'm skeptical of its future. Don't get me wrong, this situation is much better for the Native Americans than in real life, but to be frank, almost anything is. While Tecumseh's Confederacy / the Great Lakes Confederacy is nominally an independent country by and for Native Americans, I can't help but feel that it's going to become a British protectorate. According to Prophetstown on the Wabash by Timothy Willig, while Tecumseh sought to usher in a cultural revival and religious reform, he seemed to be coming about it from a conservative mindset, favoring a return to traditional hunting methods and regulating trade with white people, supporting friendships and ties with the Europeans, and denouncing the Americans. While Tippecanoe / Prophetstown was a major community center, I can't find a real population estimate. Willig says that only a series of closely connected and multi-tribal villages matched it, but cites an estimated population of 2,000. That's not a lot of natives in the kind of concentrated communities that would allow them to create and maintain their own standing army, leaving them more reliant on the British than they'd like. To be fair, I think Tecumseh was likely aware of the raw manpower disparity between the US and British North America, but with hindsight, this territory falling under de facto British authority will make it more accessible to immigrants to Canada, allowing them to squeeze the natives in a similar move to the US's own actions in the decades to come. A British, later Canadian, monopoly on the Great Lakes obviously has implications. I don't necessarily think that it'll be as attractive to other immigrants as it was for the US. For one thing, it will still be seen as a native protectorate for several years, rather than a full-on colony or province, which will see some restrictions on settlers. Add in the lack of self-government for at least a few decades, and however the region is carved up, the population will probably be smaller than its American state counterparts. While it does probably become majority white eventually due to settlers from both abroad and even the US, I imagine that the Great Lakes provinces could have a bit more of a Native American presence than they do as American states. This might leave Canada with a similar relationship to its native people as the Maori in New Zealand, but I could also see a lot of violent conflict in the future. I will say, I don't think the US will be that keen to support natives against the British here. While an eye for an eye would be very tempting, I feel that the anti-native sentiment and the fact that the US also wants that very same land could make that harder to justify. Moving further east, the Republic of New England is there. It's going to be going through growing pains. While it's protected its trade interests with Britain, it's also cut itself out of the Union, which means that it loses free movement of goods between southern cotton and the textile mills of Boston and Hartford. This is, shall we say, not great for an economy that revolves around trade and secondary production. While the majority of the country is more rural and self-sufficient, this will cause poverty in the cities, at least until an agreement can be reached with either the US or Britain. And frankly, it would wind up tied into the sphere of influence of the larger country. Politically, like the US, New England will probably be going through a partisan collapse. The Federalist elitism simply wasn't popular anywhere, and as a result, they'd probably still start retiring or jumping ship into the Democratic Republican Party, causing that party to become divided and eventually split. However, given that this region was the base of power for the Federalists, I can't imagine the opposition to a national bank or even protectionism becoming as extreme as it did in real-life America. The divides will be more along populism and the rate of the tariff rather than whether or not there should be any. It is also possible that the Federalists, carried by the honeymoon period of independence, are given just enough of a boost to begin adopting more populist ideals that see them survive, while the DRs become the Republicans or Liberals. And since that saves me from having to make up party names without Jackson or Clay, I'm going to go with it. Also, Oregon is British now, but that's not relevant yet. Neither they or the US started projecting power into the area until the 1820s. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know that you want to see more content like this going forward. Now, ultimately, politics in North America are still mostly driven by the US and Britain. Even with the unstable domestic politics and this humiliation, the US will still be a very big fish in a small pond. And now it's looking to reassert its claims to greatness, meaning that even outside the war with Britain, I would expect to see expansionism come into vogue. In our timeline, a lot of expansionist fervor was blocked by northern or otherwise anti-slavery attitudes. Cuba, more of Mexico, etc. But we've effectively removed that lobby from American politics. The Senate is dominated by slave states and the House isn't much better. Thus, I can imagine the US pushing a lot more aggressively into the Caribbean. It's pretty well known how much the South wanted Cuba, and here there's not a lot stopping it. The story is similar with regards to Hispaniola, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. However, we should consider Florida. In our timeline, the US, fresh off the War of 1812, was able to bully Spain into giving up the peninsula under the Adams-Onis Treaty. Here, that's not 100% certain. After all, with the collapse of New England and its lackluster showing, the US might not seem like enough of a threat for Spain to hand it over for free. And while I think the US would be more fervent in its need to expand and assert itself as a great power, it might also be too humiliated by the treaty to think that war over a small peninsula like Florida is worth it. If war does break out, I imagine the US does successfully capture Florida, and almost certainly attempts it with the remains of the Spanish West Indies, but we really don't know how the naval balance between the two is at this point, so it is entirely unpredictable. Now, jumping up to around the 1860s, I can see a divergence of path for the US. One where the Upper South, Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky begin industrialization in their own right due to the void left by New England and the Canadian Midwest. After all, people respond to opportunity and necessity, and the lack of the mills and later heavy industry in the Union relative to our timeline creates both. In this scenario, the 1820s and 30s see more and more textile mills pop up in the cities of Richmond, Louisville, Raleigh, etc., which, given the lack of opportunity for poor whites in the area due to all the slavery, could wind up working out decently well as people move into the cities where the jobs are. Western Virginia, not West Virginia, would probably benefit a lot from this, since the coal mining would be a lucrative industry in this scenario. This also creates a situation where more of the population is trying to sell secondary goods like processed clothes or artisan wares, but are limited due to the fact that 30% of the population is literally forbidden from owning property, stimulating anti-slavery sentiments in these states, possibly galvanized by the anti-establishment attitude rampant throughout the country. Not to mention the trend of industrialization creating urbanization that creates calls for political and social rights, and reform would happen in these states. In this timeline, as the Upper South industrializes, it becomes more like the mid-Atlantic states of Jersey and Pennsylvania, which, in combination with the Caribbean expansionism, creates a dynamic akin to the real-life antebellum period. Caribbean expansionism can only go so far, and hypothetical gains in the Great Plains and Mexico will run into the same environmental and economic pressures they did in real life. There's also a scenario where the Upper South doesn't make these changes, and the country as a whole remains more agricultural. This America will likely be more similar to Argentina, Austria, or Brazil. While large in terms of size and population, and at least a little more industrialized than countries like Spain or Russia, these nations all struggle to adapt their economies for the heavy industrial needs of the late 19th to early 20th century. The greater agrarianism, weaker national institutions, and the strong army that got the country through the 1820s would become an undercurrent of American politics going forward, which could be destabilizing for the Republic. In addition, in either path, but especially this one, the greater percentage of slaves would have dire consequences for the economy. According to the National Park Service in 1860, the South only had about 29% of the country's rail lines, the North received 7 out of 8 immigrants to the country, and while it's true that over 60% of the cotton produced worldwide came from the South, 4/5 of the country's corn, the crop that people can actually eat, came out of the North. Now, imagine a version of the US without the majority of its free states, and wherein the Upper South doesn't effectively become the new North. Frankly, I think it would be worse off than the Confederates, because at least the CSA benefited from several decades of infrastructure that literally could not happen in this America. Come to think of it, I think that despite the absence of the North to lobby against it, slavery might be more untenable in this America than in ours. About 1/3 of the Confederate population was enslaved in 1860, and that was enough that it caused logistical and manpower problems due to the need to prevent a slave revolt while the majority of the men were off at the front. Here, even if we have absolutely no way of knowing the demographics of the US, we can be very certain it's got a higher percentage of slaves due to everything we've talked about. In addition, there's probably less money going into the federal government to actually fund an army or militias to prevent rebellion, both because of the lower tariffs and a generally smaller economy. As a result, the white supremacist rule over the country requires a lot harsher control than even in our timeline, lest a revolt get out of hand like it did in Haiti. Panning out to the rest of the Americas and the world, we run into a slight snag. While you'd think that a collapsed US would let the Europeans get up to all sorts of hijinks against the Monroe Doctrine, there's this slight problem of Britain still having a lot of commercial ties and interests they'll be very eager to protect. Granted, London can't be everywhere all at once, so it's still more possible than it was in our world where Britain and America were working in tandem, but it is difficult to think of anything specific. Maybe France sniped Panama or something and got the canal, or Germany conquered Uruguay. Okay, that last one does admittedly feel ripped out of a Victoria 2 game, but you see what I mean, right? This is one of the scenarios where the butterfly effect gets out of hand very quickly. Japan is a good example of this. It was opened up in the 19th century by the United States in real life, and last time we prevented that in the Mexican Century video, I had them carved up into spheres of influence just like China, but that was just as much vibes as anything else. What's to stop France from opening them up and sending them on a similar path to our timeline? Or Britain from attempting a full takeover due to some unforeseen attack on a ship that got too close to Kyushu. For the sake of argument, we'll go with France knocking on their door and accidentally setting off something like the Meiji Restoration. However, back in North America, it's 1867 and it's Canada's birthday. Literally, as this is when it was confederated. Now, with the Midwest, Canada might become a dominion a little sooner just due to how many more people it can now host. This, frankly monstrous dominion of Canada would have near complete self-government with some exceptions for foreign policy and trade within the empire. However, Canada in this scenario would be even more centered on the St. Lawrence River watershed due to having Tim Horton counterparts of Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, etc. These are all major cities in the US, and I fail to see a reason they wouldn't be in Canada. While we talked about the Midwest being a Native American confederacy, and I do think that this region would have a higher degree of surviving natives than in real life, I also think that as Canada attracts immigrants and gains more self-government, they will push to expand the frontier of their settlement, hence creating a situation similar to today. However, on the other side of the continent, lest we not forget, Britain does have Oregon on top of what we know as British Columbia. Now, like I said, this wasn't super relevant at the time of the treaty with the US, but given that I'm from here, and this video is partially inspired by a comment asking about an independent Oregon country, yes, I do genuinely think I had to jump through this many hoops to get there. Let's have some fun with it. Now, meet John McLaughlin, the head of the Hudson's Bay Company on the West Coast, several thousand miles from the Hudson's Bay. In effect, he was in charge of the British activities in the area. For some context, from about 1818 to 1848, what we know as the Oregon Territory was under joint American-British occupation. However, McLaughlin, being an idealist and Scotsman born in Quebec, did not like the Anglo-dominated British government and rather illegally favored the Americans, though he did try to steer the region towards independence from both. Now, British Columbia in our timeline did not join the Canadian Confederation until the 1870s due to divergent economic interests and a lack of a railroad between the two sides of the continent. Here, those factors will be even more true due to Canada's Midwestern territory and Oregon's greater size and population, compared to BC anyway. While it wouldn't officially become a dominion until later, like Newfoundland briefly did, I can see a dominion of Oregon being formed in this situation. There could feasibly be nibbles of California involved due to Mexico's near collapse in the 1840s, but it's not super relevant to the video. Such a Dominion of Oregon would likely be centered around Vancouver, Washington, or Portland rather than the larger Canadian city. And yes, this is my own provincialism, but hear me out here. It's more centrally located within the colony, 60 years older, and on a major river that bisects the colony. Granted, it doesn't matter too much, but it is worth considering. In terms of politics, I imagine that Oregon would have very strong ties to Australia, China, Mexico, Britain, etc. It would likely have a heavy mining lobby in addition to the famous fur trade, due to encompassing BC and potentially parts of California, meaning gold will likely be found. There will likely also be some American elements to Oregon's politics, especially regarding things like suffrage and homesteading. Perhaps this is referred to as the Democratic Party as a nod to its counterpart in the US. In contrast, the miners and heavy industrial workers that concentrate in the cities who favor hard money and are probably more pro-British could be any number of things, but since basically every British Commonwealth country manages to sneak a Liberal Party in there somewhere, we'll go with that. Regarding when they actually become a Dominion, we'll use the short-lived Dominion of Newfoundland as reference. They gained self-government in 1907 and had a population of around 230k. In contrast, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Idaho had 293,000 in 1880. Now granted, that's messy and flawed logic, both because that's not really why Newfoundland became a Dominion, it just refused Confederation until it was too broke otherwise, and we're assuming that those states have the same population, which is incredibly dubious, but my point is more about them becoming a Dominion in the 19th century than anything else. Back in the US, things are still tricky to figure out. If we assume the Upper South didn't make the industrial reforms, that's honestly not great for the state apparatus. The US in that scenario could lack the means to prevent a slave uprising or even maintain control over the Latin American populations of Cuba and Puerto Rico if they even conquered those territories in this timeline. I could honestly see the country slowly withering on the vine like the first Brazilian Republic did, unable to contain the blatant corruption of an increasingly authoritarian oligarchy and dominated by a few industries. In Brazil, this was coffee and beef. Well, dairy, but you have one, you have the other. In the US, it would probably be cotton and sugar, depending on the southern border, possibly coal since they still have Appalachia. It would likely still be vulnerable to strongman politics, due to the need for a force of will to bring the state to bear, and a constant instability in the southern states that make up the majority of its land and population. Even if they do make those reforms, I feel as though the relations between the US and British Empire would be very tense for a long time, possibly the rest of the century. The US would feel as though the British protectorate and settlement of the Midwest is hypocritical and only meant to weaken them, both true, resent them propping up the New England Republic, and likely issue a new claim to Oregon based on how many Americans would probably still settle the area. However, their window where that war would be winnable would be incredibly narrow, and the version of American politics that I'm envisioning will not be able to take the opportunity without risking control over the Caribbean. Thus, as the world marches into the 20th century, I have to end the video here. By what some call sheer dumb luck, the British were able to win just the right battles to secure their native allies and force New England to secede, dooming the American war effort in 1812. From there, they were able to bring the Great Lakes to heel as a protectorate and eventual province for their Dominion of Canada, wrap New England around their finger, and secure Oregon. In contrast, the US was sent on a spiral of instability and struggled to find itself. Its fate determined just as much by whether or not its remaining states were able to adapt, or if they doubled down on expansionism and reactionary rhetoric that only created more instability in the long run. Before we go, thank you to Dai Kami, Nafumato, and Grimwalt for supporting the channel, and an extra special thank you to Grimwalt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.